Murder, robbery, rape. That's how crime has been defined for millennia. You will never stop people taking drugs. All we can do is harm reduction. But to mass incarcerate them so that private prisons can make billions, tens of billions a year, and kick this money down to politicians, tens of millions a year in political contributions right now, it's absolutely sickening, and it's at the taxpayer's expense.
Hello, and welcome back to Crime Suspect. Each week, we're going to be unravelling some of the UK's most prolific crimes, as well as providing in-depth analysis on the criminality that plagues our nation. On the show today, British prisons are bursting at the seams. With overcrowding nearing breaking point, convicted criminals who should be off our streets could be on them instead. Next, is it safe in your neighbourhood? I'll be taking you, virtually, to Cleveland for this week's Postcode Watch. And finally, it's your chance to book a crook as we show you this week's wanted criminals. Joining me for all of this today is ex-BBC Home Affairs correspondent, now a crime and policing commentator, Danny Shaw. Former ecstasy smuggler and now a successful author and YouTuber, Shaun Attwood. And the London Victims Commissioner, Claire Waxman. Thank you very much, everyone, for being here today. Now, you have the right to remain watching. This is Crime Suspect. With just over 500 spaces left across the entire prison estate, the population behind bars in Britain is at an all-time high, and it's estimated to be costing taxpayers a whopping £47,000 per year per prisoner. Some jails, like Wandsworth, where terror suspect Daniel Khalif is alleged to have escaped from, hold 70% more prisoners than they legally should. Now, new guidance from the Justice Secretary, Alex Chalk, will see convicted criminals who are sentenced to less than 12 months sent into the community rather than be locked up. Danny, how big is the UK's prison population?
Well, the population in England and Wales, which is where the problems predominantly lie, is well over 88,000. That is a record level, never been as high as that before. It's gone up. It's doubled, basically, in the last 30 years. It was 40,000 in the early 90s, and it's just been rising and rising and rising. And what that means is that you have around 60% or so of prisoners held in overcrowded conditions. What it means is you have high rates of reoffending, so you have prisoners, particularly those on short prison sentences, for whom prison doesn't work. Around 50% of them are reconvicted or cautioned again within a year of getting out of prison. So it clearly doesn't really work in terms of cutting reoffending. And there are also, as we know, problems with violence, with drugs, and also self-harm and suicide. So really, the prisons are in a pretty bad state.
So we're locking more people up, crime is increasing, which tells me prison's not working.
Well, it doesn't work for many people with those reoffending rates. It works in the sense that if you have someone who is dangerous or violent or a sexual offender and they're locked up in prison, they're not committing crimes in the community. So you're protecting the public, and that's a really important part of what imprisonment is for. But in terms of rehabilitation, in terms of ensuring that people who go to prison get the skills, perhaps improve their education, perhaps, equip themselves for a job when they leave, it doesn't really work enough. There are some good prisons, there are some establishments that work really well, but they're few and far between.
When are we going to reach full capacity?
Well, we're almost there, Peter. I mean, there's just over 500 spare places right across the 120 jails. Now, what that essentially means is that you have got some prisoners being held in police stations overnight because of the shortage of space. You've got other prisoners who are being fast-tracked into open prisons where the security is not so tight because there is some space there. That's not great either. And then you've got them being transferred around the country. It's a game of musical chairs. So that's the situation. We could have a situation tomorrow. We could have a situation in the next few days when actually the population surpasses the capacity completely.
Shaun, you served 6 years in prison, a lengthy jail term by anybody's reckoning, I would imagine. What was the moment when you went, I'm going to leave this all behind? When I get out, I'm going to contribute to society. I'm going to be a successful YouTuber and an author of 17 books, and the list goes on.
Facing a 200-year sentence, my second year in a maximum security Madison Street Jail, Phoenix, Arizona, in extreme conditions, crushed that immature side of me out, the crazy, wild person who foolishly imported ecstasy. Extreme conditions, we talked about the violence last time, people's heads getting smashed against the walls, heads getting bashed against toilets, teeth flying out. The heat, this is the Sonoran Desert, almost 50 degrees. When you're sweating constantly every day, your skin turns soggy, but you've got all these skin infections and bed sores, and you scratch yourself, clumps of skin come off under your nails.
On that note, you've painted a really ghastly, ghastly picture there. So, being incarcerated in such a dreadful situation, that actually prompted you to say to yourself, I'm never going back, was that it?
Yeah, so in the second year, as the conditions intensified, because I wasn't cooperating, and I was facing 200 years, and they told me, if you go to trial and lose, you know, you're going to spend the rest of your life in here. I'm not trying to ask for people's pity. I totally put myself in these conditions, but at that point, I was going to kill myself. I planned to do it after a guarded security walk. I was going to say goodbye to my family and friends. I had 7 photos, mum, dad, girlfriend, sister. Get these photos out, and I started crying looking at the picture of my mum, thinking, your mum's going to get a call saying you slashed your wrist in a foreign jail. And that's what stopped me from doing it. But it was reaching that moment that crushed that side out of me, because when I did get sentenced to 9.5 years, it was the happiest day of my life. My $1 million house on the mountain didn't matter anymore. My plasma screen TV, my swimming pool and jacuzzi, all those things, all that material stuff, who cares? All I wanted was to get my life back. So it's set me a whole new value system.
So you were completely broken down, and then you rebuilt yourself.
It crushed that persona out of me. English Shaun, the rave kingpin, was crushed out of me.
Okay. Now, we've heard as part of the announcement from Alex Chalk, the Justice Secretary, that prisoners who would qualify for a sentence of less than 12 months or up to 12 months are going to get some kind of community punishment, a community order, and there's been talk of removing graffiti and the like. From a victim's perspective, and I'm very conscious we haven't mentioned victims yet, what do you think they might be thinking about an offender receiving a community sentence rather than going to prison?
I think they're going to be very anxious and very concerned. A lot of the victims that we speak to on a regular basis, many of the offenders do get under 12 months, and we're talking for stalking cases, domestic abuse, coercive control, where there is a real risk to that victim. So to have them out in the community will actually make that victim, will sort of escalate that fear for them around their safety. And what can we do to reassure them? You know, we know that the probation service, we've talked about prison, but our probation service is chronically under-resourced. There's been lots of issues around the managing of offenders in communities. So how are they going to, without extra investment, how are the probation service going to manage those that are on licence conditions or have got protective orders in place, bail conditions, etc.? What are we going to do to make sure that that victim is safe?
And shouldn't people that commit the offences we've talked about, assault and stalking, shouldn't they be in prison?
Well, I believe they have to be, because it also gives respite to those victims who often repeat victims. And as I say, there's a real risk to them. But as Danny talked about, we need to look at rehabilitation, because for a lot of these cases, when we see repeat victimisation and reoffending, it's because we're not dealing with the core behaviour. So we need to look at more rehabilitation programmes, especially for stalking and domestic abuse.
Punishment without rehabilitation, I would like to think we're all singing from the same song sheet. We're all agreed that it's essentially a waste of time, isn't it? Literally just banging them up and closing the door and leaving people to their own devices.
It becomes a revolving door, doesn't it? So,
yeah.
And that's when a lot of victims I speak to who are repeat victims in those particular offences, those particular crimes, just say it's relentless for them.
But there are, of course, unmistakably, people that need locking up. as Danny alluded to, for the protection of the public and so that victims see some justice and feel safe and secure, perhaps. Now, we spoke to a victim of a vicious assault, Jade Driscoll, who has issued a stark warning to fix the prison crisis before someone is killed.
My name's Jade Driscoll. I'm 31, from Newcastle. What happened to me at the hands of Paul Flynn? I was attacked for asking him to leave when I no longer wanted him there. I was punched. I was pinned against the wall by my neck. I was dragged outside. I had my phone stolen, so I couldn't call for help. I was kicked in the head here. I was kicked in the face. And then I was just left. I mean, obviously, I've explained what happened to me. He wasn't even sent to prison. He was remanded for 7 months. Then because he pleaded guilty, just walked out that very same day. It was explained that he's already done it before, obviously, but he had done it to me. He's had 2 injunctions placed on him already from women. But the next time he does it, what about this time? What more did he need to do to me? We need a deterrent. There's nothing to deter anybody from doing anything. Maybe if they would actually get some sentences, maybe these people who are in and out of jail wouldn't really want to be in and out of jail. It's laughable.
Claire, this was a man who had 78, I'll repeat that, 78 previous convictions, yet he walked free from court, did not get a jail term. What more needs to be done with whatever aspect of the system it is so that that man gets a punishment that is suitable?
I mean, obviously, it's a shocking case, but it's not unusual. And as I say, I deal with victims all the time, and we have seen very serious offenders, repeat offenders, come out with suspended sentences or very lenient sentences as well. And the victim feels like, what was the point of going through that process of coming forward and reporting, going through a very lengthy, complex and traumatic justice process? We have record Crown Court backlogs in this country. It can take victims a number of years from the time of reporting to police to get into court. So to get that kind of outcome at the end, many will feel like, what was the point of going through it? But I do know that when we work so closely with the police and the CPS, if we're not getting good enough evidence, if we're not building strong enough cases, that affects the types of charges that are put forward on a case. And then, of course, as the victim's information, like victim personal statements, which are so important for a judge to hear around the impact on the victim, then that impacts the way that the judge might sentence. And all those things are not happening as they should.
Yeah. Shaun, you've interviewed many criminals on your podcast over the years. With regards to, I don't like the expression low-level offending, because it's not low level if it's your phone that's stolen, your bike that you go to work on is stolen, your house is burgled and the such like. But if we look at crimes that are committed that will not lead to a jail sentence now, do you think people are going to be more likely to commit those crimes because there's no deterrent for them?
So going back to your earlier point, prisons, what I saw, are completely overcrowded with low-level drug offenders. The highest arrest category in the history of criminal justice was weed possession. It's the heroin users that cause the disproportionate amount of acquisitive crime that you mentioned, the burglaries, the shoplifting, etc. And Portugal had tremendous results with getting their heroin users down. So I think that it could be addressed through a sensible drug policy. Let's get rid of the mentally ill. Let's get rid of the low-level drug users. Let's get rid of all the soldiers who come back from wars. More than half my friends in prison were soldiers, come back from wars, PTSD, didn't get any help from the government, ended up self-medicating on street drugs and ended up in prison. So let's address the root causes of who are these people. Prisons need to go back to people who harm other people, murder, robbery, rape. That's how crime has been defined for millennia. You will never stop people taking drugs. All we can do is harm reduction. But to mass incarcerate them so that private prisons can make billions, tens of billions a year, and kick this money down to politicians, tens of millions a year in political contributions right now, it's absolutely sickening, and it's at the taxpayer's expense.
Thank you. Danny, I'm waving my magic wand in your direction, and you are now appointed the all-seeing, all-knowing head of the UK prisons, the whole estate, what would you seek to do? What would you change?
Well, if you had investment, if you had the Treasury behind you saying, here, you've got billions that you can invest, you would sell off some of the crumbling old Victorian prisons, you build some new prisons, you would make sure that the most violent, the dangerous offenders have substantial sentences, and when they're released, have an adequate licence period so they can be monitored on release. That's really important as well. There can't be a cliff edge. I think there is an issue, and the government is going to have to confront this, with people being given short sentences, because if it wants to reduce the number of people on short sentences, there are some of those offenders who frankly need to be behind bars, because, as Claire says, they've committed serious crimes and victims want to see them at least go to prison for a short time. And equally, they are repeat offenders for whom community sentences haven't worked, suspended sentences haven't worked, fines haven't worked. So it's about getting a balance. I mean, what I would want to see is certainly, I think there can be a reduction in the female prison population. I think many of those people, there's around approaching 4,000 women in prison. Many of those are not there for violent offences. They can be held in different sort of institutions, on tags, perhaps on curfews, to make sure they comply with some of those conditions. And also there are non-violent offenders in the male population. Similarly, they can be held in the community on tags and curfews. That requires investment in probation. It requires a big shift in our prisons. But you're still going to need short prison terms for some people. And that's the difficult decision I think the government has got to make, because it can't simply just abolish those sentences completely.
I do feel like they're papering over the cracks of a much bigger issue, which is the entire criminal justice system is underinvested. So if you're going to start looking at changing things within prison, as Danny has said, then we have to have a probation service that is well funded and works so that they can manage offenders and help with rehabilitation and check that they're keeping to their licence conditions, etc. That's not working effectively. And then we've got to look at record Crown Court backlogs. How are we going to tackle that? Because victims are having to wait far too long for justice. And if they're going to get no sentence and come out into the community, that is really going to make victims and the public lack trust and confidence in the criminal justice system.
Yes, it's not a great cheery picture that we're painting here, unfortunately, but...
It's when you've starved a system for so many years of money, it's collapsing, and that's what happens.
We do bring the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth to crime suspects, so thank you all very much indeed for your contributions. Right, moving on to this week's Postcode Watch, and we're in the UK's most dangerous place to live, Cleveland. The annual crime rate here is 59.8 crimes per 1,000 people per year as of October this year. Violent crime makes up 33.4% of all crimes reported, totalling 35,200 offences, which is an increase of 4.7% when compared year over year in the period of September 2022 to August 2023. Shoplifting was the fastest growing crime, and it increased by 21.7% over the last 12 months, while criminal damage and arson is at 233% of the national crime rate, totalling 11,001 cases, putting Cleveland first out of 99 of England and Wales's postcode areas for this category. Smashing and burning things in Cleveland seems to be a very popular pastime for some unscrupulous fools. All right, it's now time for the part of the show where we bring you mugs of thugs who are terrorising our streets. But firstly, some success, as Daniel Ruckledge, who featured on one of our appeals last week, has now been arrested. Ruckledge has been charged with a burglary in Pontefract and has been remanded in custody. Thank you all, especially if you were the viewer that picked up the phone. Now, moving on to this week's wanted criminals. First up is this suspect. The Met Police are investigating a sexual assault on Clapham Common, after a woman in her 20s was reportedly sexually assaulted inside a public toilet. This man is described as in his 20s, of slim build with black hair. He is thought to be around 5'10" and of Arabian appearance. Next, we have Kevin McMahon, who is wanted for a breach of a court order. He was recently spotted in Southport Town Centre and has links to the Bootle area of Liverpool. McMahon has a Scottish accent and is described as approximately 5'9" tall, of a proportionate build with brown eyes, black hair and a greying beard. Lastly, have you seen this man? Surrey police have released a CCTV image of a man wanted in connection with a recent serious assault at the Urban Kitchen in Reigate. Police were called to the bar following reports of an altercation between two groups of people, resulting in 3 people being injured. If you know or have seen any of these crooks, get in touch anonymously with Crime Stoppers on 0800 555 111. Right, that's all we've got time for this week. Many thanks to Danny, Sean and Claire. Be sure to leave us a comment, like and subscribe, and we'll be back next week for more Crime Suspect.